we are concerned with the very fundamental constitutional issue of whether or not the government of the United States can indeed make distinction between citizens on the basis of ancestry or national origin.
His whole life was a life of leadership. That entire spectrum of leadership, from a lawyer to a community activist and a patriot, his entire life.
This is my country. I come from the Hood River Valley, and I was nurtured by the soil. This is my home. And having that kind of a feeling, I want to make this our country the best in the world.
Minoru Yasui, known as Min, was born in 1916 in the farming community of Hood River, Oregon. His parents, Masuo and Shizuyo, were first-generation Japanese immigrants known as Issei. Their children, the second generation, were known as Nisei. Min was a third son in a large but close-knit family. The Issei were considered aliens ineligible for citizenship, because at that time, U.S. law permitted only so-called free white persons to become naturalized citizens. But the Nisei born in the U.S. were citizens by birthright under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The Yasui family, Issei parents and Nisei children, settled in the valley nestled between the Columbia River and Mount Hood and pursued their American dream.
Hood River is a small rural community. Back in the early days, there were probably 75 to 100 Japanese American families here. Father and my uncle ran a dry goods store called the Yasui Brothers. They sold curios, food, and provisions. Dad spoke English. As a result, he was able to negotiate many kinds of contracts and deals with the landowners in this area. He began to develop interest in farm operations in the Hood River Valley.
Masuo was a successful orchardist and farmer, active in the Apple Growers Association, Rotary Club, and Methodist Church. Because his English was fluent, he was considered the spokesman for the Japanese and leader of the community. But in the 1920s, when Min was a child, anti-Asian sentiment was strong in Oregon. These feelings were inflamed by the influence of the Ku Klux Klan, which made major inroads in the state at that time. And in Hood River, there was organized opposition to Japanese ownership of farmland. Despite these hostile undercurrents, the Yasui family, like many immigrants, held fast to their belief in America as the land of opportunity.
Growing up in the Hood River Valley, one of the things that Dad was very adamant about is that because you are a part of the soil, because you are a part of America, he insisted the community, and indeed our family, really sink their roots deep and become American.
So the Yasui children grew up not only pledging allegiance to the flag, but also enjoying typical outdoor activities such as hiking, fishing, and hunting. All the sons participated in the Hood River Boy Scouts. The youngest son, Homer, recalls Min as an attentive big brother who loved the outdoors.
He used to take my next oldest brother, Roku, Shu, and me out on trips. And one of the nice things he'd do, he'd take us down the Hood River and take us exploring. So we'd go out on the, try to catch little fish with our hands.
Since there were only 2 sisters among 6 brothers in the Yasui family, the 2 girls, Michi and Yuka, were close. Min had a special bond with his youngest sister, Yuka.
He loved Yuka because, Yuka's the baby of the family, so he'd call her pumpkins and, things like that.
I was so lucky to have a big brother who doted on me. We lived downtown, and across the street, there was a big bank of nothing but wild flowers. And men would say, "Oh, let's go flower picking." And he would point out that this is a spring beauty, this is a buttercup, this is a bluebell. So when springtime comes, I think men, and I think, what a gift, men. Thank you, thank you.
In 1931, at the age of 15, Min helped to found the Mid-Columbia chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, a patriotic civic organization for Nisei. And 2 years later, he graduated salutatorian from Hood River High School. Min enrolled at the University of Oregon and continued to excel academically. He pledged a national honorary scholastic fraternity, Phi Beta Kappa, and he began to make a name for himself as an orator. Meanwhile, in Hood River, the Yasui store and orchards prospered, and the family moved to a large house where they had plenty of room to host the older son's college friends for weekends and holidays. Throughout his university years, Min continued to work with the Japanese American Citizens League in its mission to foster good citizenship and civic participation. He attended the biennial national conventions in San Francisco and Seattle as a member and leader of the Mid-Columbia chapter, solidifying what was to become a lifelong commitment to the JACL. He made friends easily and enjoyed horsing around with his pals at college, including fellow cadets in the Reserve Officers Training Corps. But he took his duties as a U.S. citizen very seriously, continuing ROTC for an extra year in order to earn a commission as second lieutenant. He graduated from the University of Oregon in 1937 and from the School of Law in 1939. However, in spite of his high qualifications, he was unable to get a job in Oregon as an attorney, so he accepted the position as attaché to the Japanese consul in Chicago. By this time, Japanese Americans in Hood River had their own spacious community hall. This photograph, with Masuo and Shizuyo in the center, reflects the American dreams and aspirations of a thriving community. But for Japanese Americans everywhere, their world was shattered on December 7, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan.
Min immediately quit his job in Chicago and headed home to Oregon, intending to report for duty with his reserve Army unit. The older Yasui children were working or away at college. Only the two youngest, Homer and Yuka, remained at home with their parents.
Pretty soon we heard that they were rounding up Japanese school teachers, Japanese ministers, anybody who had leadership roles in their communities. We knew Dad was on that list somewhere.
On December 12th, Masuo was arrested by the FBI.
We had no idea where Dad was. We didn't know whether he had been shot, whether he was in prison, whether he had been deported.
When Min got back to Oregon, he reported to Camp Vancouver.
Some ranking officer told me that I would not be accepted immediately at that time, but they would let me know. Well, frankly, they never did let me know, so I never did join the United States Army. I felt terrible because I was perfectly willing, and I did come back with the expectation of serving my country.
In the wake of Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiment, which had been simmering on the West Coast for decades, exploded into vindictive hatred.
I remember the sheriff in Hood River telling me that it wasn't safe for me to be walking down the street because someone would take a shot at me. The feeling was very intense. It certainly was very much opposed to the presence of Japanese Americans in this area.
I went into this store, and this storeman came on and he says, "God damn it, get out of here." And I said, "No, I just want to buy some bread." He said, "You can't read?" And on the storefront it says, "No goddamn Japs or dirty dogs allowed in this store." And I said, "I want to buy some bread." He says, "Listen, goddamn kid, you're a Jap. Go home and eat rice."
Nearly 75 years later, Oregon State Representative Brian Clem, introducing a bill to establish Minoru Yasui Day, described the temper of the times.
And there's a newspaper article, this came from the Hood River paper at the time, and it says, "These are the lists of all the Japanese farmers and their names and their acreages. Next week we will try and place a check mark in front of each piece sold since Pearl Harbor. Our ultimate aim will be to get a check in front of each and every name." So they wanted to get all their land.
Which eventually they did, buying up hundreds of acres of land developed by Japanese farmers as the federal government made plans to take care of the so-called Japanese problem on the West Coast. Men moved to Portland, the largest city in Oregon, in order to open a law practice and to have better access to government offices. His legal services were in great demand by the Japanese American community to deal with frozen bank accounts, revocation of licenses, and other complications caused by new and changing government regulations. Then, 10 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor,
on February 19, 1942, the President of the United States issued Executive Order 9066, which provided that the Secretary of War and all subordinate commanders would have the authority to declare certain war zones and to prescribe certain rules and regulations.
General John DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, declared an area approximately 100 miles inland from the coast as Military Area 1. They included half the states of Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona.
And within these particular restricted areas, the military commander issued a curfew order and travel restriction applied against all enemy aliens of Italian descent, against the German enemy alien, and all persons of Japanese ancestry.
It seemed to me that a military order distinguishing between one citizen on one hand and another citizen on the basis of ancestry was absolutely wrong.
The curfew was the first governmental action that he could violate to challenge the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066, because the curfew said all persons of Japanese ancestry. That was the first governmental order that he could take an action against, and he did that.
We look for a test case because certainly under the Constitution, under the laws, we have the right to appeal any order that we think is not proper. We want to find a nice GI, honorably discharged from the United States Army, have a cute wife, a couple of very endearing children, make a wonderful test case, but unfortunately.
I've asked groups of lawyers, would you be willing to do this? Would you put your professional career on the line? Would you put your personal liberty on the line to test the constitutionality of an order? And in one room of 70 lawyers, these were government lawyers, one person raised his hand. So these are people representing the government, and they wouldn't trust the court system.
But unfortunately, when you talk about a year in jail, a $5,000 fine, we couldn't find anyone.
So for Yasui to do that against all odds is incredible. It is something that is just extraordinary.
But this is the United States of America, founded in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And this was happening in our country. As an American citizen, as a lawyer, I felt that we owed at least the obligation as a citizen to tell our government they are wrong. That is the sacred duty of every citizen. Because what is done to the least of us can be done to all of us. I knew that we had to protest this.
So Min set out to purposely violate Proclamation Number 3, the curfew imposed on all persons of Japanese ancestry. On March 28, 1942, he left his law office at 8 p.m.
I walked for over 3 hours, and I got tired of walking up and down 3rd Avenue, so I did approach a police officer. And being a smart aleck and being an attorney, I pulled out the proclamation pointing out that I was in violation of. I had my birth certificate with me, and I proved that I was a person of Japanese ancestry. Asked the officer to arrest me, and the officer said, "Look, you'll get in trouble. Go on, run along home." And that certainly didn't serve my purposes, so I went down to the 2nd Avenue police station and talked to the sergeant and explained what I wanted done, and the sergeant obliged me, and he threw me into the drunk tank. That's how the case began at 11:20 p.m., 28th day of March, 1942.
When news got out that Min had been arrested, he was very concerned about Mom and her mental health and her distress. And I say, Min called and he says, Mom, I know you're very worried because your dad is gone. We don't even know where Dad is. And now I'm in prison. And he apologized to Mom for giving her more grief, more to worry about.
I knew Mother was home, so I called up saying, "Okasan shinpai shiteru desho. Mother, you must be worried." Mother says, "Shinpai dokoro ka susumeru so." Translated, it means worry nonsense. I encourage you. I stimulate and spur you on.
After spending the weekend in the drunk tank, Min was released on bail the following Monday. A week later, the National Secretary of the JACL, Mike Masaoka, issued an official statement about Min Yasui. National headquarters is unalterably opposed to test cases to determine the constitutionality of military regulations. Self-styled martyrs capture the headlines. But we have pledged our wholehearted cooperation. In spite of this stunning rejection by the organization he had helped to found, Min pressed on. He wrote to General John L. DeWitt, who issued the curfew and travel restrictions, declaring that the President of our United States has oftentimes repeated that we are fighting a war to preserve the 4 freedoms throughout the world. Surely then, it is of paramount importance to preserve those self-same freedoms within the United States of America. General DeWitt did not answer Min's letter, but he was known to have said, "A Jap's a Jap, no matter if he's a U.S. citizen or not. The racial strains are undiluted." And he proceeded with the roundup of all persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast.
During the months of March, April, and May, the military then began to issue orders indicating that any person of Japanese ancestry would have to report to what they then called an assembly center to be moved away from the West Coast.
They were allowed to take only what they could carry. Families had to sell, store, or abandon their possessions, including houses, furniture, farms, equipment, businesses, and even pets. Men worked 16-hour days, trying to help people to prepare for eviction from their homes and communities within less than a month. The Yasui brothers' store had to quickly liquidate their stock, but they could not sell all of it before the family had to leave Hood River. Min's sister Michi was a senior at the University of Oregon in Eugene. She asked for permission to stay in Eugene for her graduation in June, but her request was denied.
When the general evacuation orders began to be issued, I thought it was a completely unwarranted kind of military action.
Without having any kind of charges filed against us, we were never confronted by witnesses who said that we did something wrong. We did not have the opportunity to defend ourselves. We were never placed before a jury of our peers, and yet a military commander, by executive order only, was saying to you, because of your ancestry, you go into a prison camp.
In May, all Japanese Americans in the Portland area, including men, were imprisoned in the Livestock Exposition Building, which had been converted into a so-called assembly center.
For the military had taken over the North Portland Livestock Pavilion. And I say that very advisedly. It was a livestock barn.
And obviously it was intended to exhibit livestock, cattle, horses, pigs, chickens, and all the rest. And as you approached it, you were led into this enclosure, surrounded again by barbed wire fences and military police.
And on each corner, you had the watchtowers. And in the watchtowers, there were searchlights, so no one could possibly escape at night.
As Min was being herded into the Portland Livestock Pavilion, the Japanese American community in Hood River, including Shizuyo, Homer, and Yuka, were ordered to board a train.
We had a cat named Nicodemus and a dog named Mike, and I was very concerned that they were not going to be evacuated with us. They could stay here, but what are you going to do with them? You can't explain to them why you're leaving them. It was kind of sad and lonely to get down to that train station. The hard and sad part was we had no idea where we were going. Was it going to be hot or cold? Do you take an overcoat? Are you going to come back?
Despite the orders by the military guards to keep the blinds closed, when the train turned south, the Yasui family knew they would be going through Eugene.
We were heading south, and Michi, my sister, was at the University of Oregon, and she caught wind that this train might be going by. So lift up the blinds, and if you lift up the blinds, they knew you were a traitor right there. You're going to spy, see what's out there. But anyway, we raised it, and we could see Michi in Eugene, and she was waving. She didn't know what she was waving at. And so my mother said, "That's Michi." But it was sad, because we thought, will we ever see Michi again?
The next day, Michi defied the same proclamation that Min challenged. She violated the travel restrictions by leaving Eugene before she was scheduled to be removed. She took a bus to Denver, Colorado, outside the exclusion area, in order to establish a home in the free zone so that her family could relocate there. Shizuyo, Homer, and Yuka continued south in the shuttered train.
We finally got to our destination, and it was Pinedale, which is right near Fresno, and hot as Hades.
But when we got to Pinedale, oh boy, it was hot. And I remember seeing a lot of the elderly people, particularly the women, fainting from the heat because it was hot and there was no shade. We were standing out in the sun and being processed inside.
Pinedale, like the Portland Livestock Pavilion, was one of 15 temporary detention centers hastily built or retrofitted by the military. In California, there were 12 of these incarceration facilities, and one each in Washington, Oregon, and Arizona. In total, over 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry were registered by the government, rounded up, tagged, and corralled into these centers, surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and military guards.
They were called assembly centers because people were being brought in, temporarily housed, and thereafter moved out. From a period of about April, May, June, they forced people into horse barns, racetracks, fairgrounds, temporary shelters built out in farmland. The facilities were rather primitive.
These detention centers, especially those previously used to house animals, were degrading.
They put up partitions out of plywood, and then they shoved in over 3,000 people into those places. And this is right at the beginning of summer. The summer got hot, of course. You had nothing but flies and stink.
But the Japanese Americans made the best of their terrible circumstances, smiling for the camera and doing what they could to improve their makeshift living quarters, until they were displaced again.
During September, they started the movement out of the assembly centers into the 10 more permanent camps in the interior of the United States. There were 2 in California at Tule Lake, 1 at Manzanar, 2 in Arizona at Poston and Gila River, 1 in Idaho, Minidoka, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in the state of Utah, Grenada. Then there were 2 in Arkansas on the river bottoms of the Arkansas River. There were Jerome and Rohr.
The entire population of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, men, women, children, and elders, were branded as enemy aliens, potential spies, and imprisoned for no other reason than their ancestry. Not a single Japanese American was ever found guilty of espionage or compromising the national security of the United States. Men and the other prisoners in the Portland Detention Center were packed off to the Minidoka concentration camp in Idaho.
They loaded us into troop trains. They drew all the blinds. They loaded their families in. They all had ID numbers. My number was 16263. They didn't tattoo it on me, but 16263.
Men recalled their arrival in the fall of 1942 during a speech at a post-war pilgrimage to the Minidoka concentration camp.
It's been almost 50 years, a half a century, and those of us who are gray and balding can well remember 42 years and 10 months ago, coming off that railroad siding down the road here a bit. Remember the luggage being piled on the siding? Your mothers, your fathers, families sitting on that luggage, watching the trucks come over the hill, kicking up clouds of dust, going up what was then a dirt road, coming across those flats with the lava outcroppings, seeing here on this slight rise, tar paper shacks that was to be our home. I know people got off the train and cried.
The Minidoka concentration camp was still under construction.
The barracks are not completed. The mess halls are not finished. The laundry, the restrooms, the bathhouses were not complete.
In August and September, it was hot, and remember the dust that blew, the dust that got into everything.
As you tear up the desert, the soil pulverizes into dust, and clouds of dust would be streaming everywhere.
And then as the winter came on, the rains came, it became chill, and the mud, the ever-present mud. And you could always spot the outhouses because as people walk through the mud, their overshoes or galoshes get stuck, and there'd be a trail of that out to the outhouses. And all surrounding those camps were barbed wire fences guarded by military police with all of the necessary paraphernalia for war, rifles, bayonets, machine guns, here in our own native country.
Shizuyo, Homer, and Yuka were taken from Pinedale to the concentration camp at Tule Lake, California.
We couldn't go outside of the fence, but every morning Mom and I would walk around the perimeter, and then you see these armed sentries in these guardhouses. There's a Methodist hymn that says, "This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that hate may be strong, but love is stronger." And she would sing that at the top of her voice.
In November, I got orders to report for trial, so they said a United States Marshal came up to Minidoka and they put handcuffs on me and they brought me to Portland.
On November 16, 1942, Minoru Yasui was found guilty in the U.S. District Court of Oregon and sentenced to 1 year in jail and a $5,000 fine. He remained in solitary confinement in this cell in the Multnomah County Jail while his appeal made its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
I languished in that solitary confinement for 9 months, 270 days and 270 nights. You couldn't see the stars at night or the sky during the day.
No, I was locked in 24 hours a day in the beginning. They wouldn't give me a haircut. They wouldn't let me cut my nails. My nails are long like that. Whiskers way down, no razor. Finally, about the 4th month, they gave me a razor and allowed me to take a bath once a week.
Men kept the censors busy, writing hundreds of letters during his 9 months of solitary confinement. Yuka kept everything he wrote to her. Yep, Christmas Day in jail too. It's the first Christmas I have ever spent in jail. And I guess it's the first Christmas that you've ever spent behind barbed wire fences, just like a herd of cattle. Writing was Min's connection to the outside world.
I asked for a typewriter, and it says, no, we can't give you a typewriter because Japs are so clever you might make a weapon out of it. They wouldn't give me anything.
So he hand-wrote everything, including articles he sent to his ex-secretary, who was imprisoned in Minidoka. She typed them up for publication in camp newsletters such as The Irrigator. Friends in Minidoka formed the Civil Liberties League and passed out flyers to support Min's legal defense. However, the National Secretary of JACL, Mike Masaoka, responded by visiting Minidoka and disbanded the league. This left Min basically standing alone.
During the time I was in jail, in solitary, I did do a lot of thinking. I guess the thing really is that I knew I was right, and I was so convinced I was right.
Min's determination and refusal to yield to bitterness seemed to have influenced the national JACL. 2 months after Masaoka broke up Min's support group in Minidoka, JACL reversed its policy and announced it would file a Friend of the Court brief on behalf of Yasui's test case before the Supreme Court.
And I always figured the United States Supreme Court is going to sustain us, so I guess there was a feeling that surely this country is going to do the right thing.
I know what the Constitution says. We know the Declaration of Independence. I believe then and I believe today that indeed all men are created equal, that there should be equal justice under the law.
On June 21, 1943, the decision on Min's appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was handed down.
What the Supreme Court said was that because of military necessity, that the government had a compelling interest to do what they did in terms of imposing a curfew.
Though Min lost his appeal before the U.S. Supreme Court, he did not lose his faith in the U.S. Constitution.
I do not believe that the Constitution failed. I think some of our institutions composed of men did indeed fail us.
His 9-month ordeal in solitary confinement was over.
I was released from the Multnomah County Jail in August of 1943, and there shipped back to Minidoka, again in irons, and I traded one jail for another.
At the Tule Lake concentration camp, Shizuo had sent Homer to Denver on a student leave to stay with Michi. She wanted to keep Yuka, her youngest, by her side. but she was concerned about her daughter's education.
Mom would say, "You can't stay in camp here. You are not getting an education. You better leave." I'm 15 years old. My mother would be left alone at camp, and she's telling me, "Get out of here. Get an education."
So Shizuyo also sent Yuka to Denver. Yuka safely arrived and enrolled at South Denver High School, while Shizuyo continued to wait for permission to leave Tule Lake. Min's return to Minidoka from Multnomah County Jail was low-key. During his absence, the Army had changed its policy regarding Nisei.
In 1943, the Army decided that those individuals who could pass a loyalty test could volunteer for the United States Army.
A questionnaire was administered to all Japanese American adults in the camps.
But question number 27 asked, would you be willing to serve the United States Army Armed Forces on combat duty wherever sent? Now, the military, of course, are interested in males over the age of 18. But bureaucracy being bureaucracy, somehow the WRA applied that to everyone. And that's stupid, because here grandpa 70 years old or grandma 60 years old is getting a question saying, are you willing to serve on armed combat? But question number 28 was even worse. It says, would you pledge unqualified allegiance to the United States of America? And every American citizen perfectly willing to say yes. But it went on further and forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. I asked myself, holy smokes, I never owed any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. If I answer that yes, I'm forswearing allegiance, and I never owed, admitting that I did owe it. If I say no, then I'm saying I won't be loyal to the United States. You're in a catch-22 situation. So many people qualified their answers, but the administration wanted a yes, yes, or a no, no.
Those who answered no, no were transferred to Tule Lake, which was designated as a high-security segregation camp for so-called disloyals to be sent to Japan. Applications for leave by so-called loyals at Tule Lake were expedited in order to make room for the influx of dissidents from the other camps who answered no, no. And Shizuyo was finally released to join Yuka and Michi in Denver. Homer had moved on to Pennsylvania to join a brother attending medical school there. Masuo, who had been shuffled through a series of Justice Department facilities, ended up in the camp in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In March of 1943, the Army started recruiting for the newly created All-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Min tried once more to enlist, but he was rejected again because he now had a criminal record.
They went to the camps and from behind barbed wire fences, 1,500 volunteers. They went to Hawaii. They wanted 1,500 volunteers and 10,000 volunteers.
The military also recruited intelligence officers. 6,000 men of Japanese ancestry were sent to the Pacific Theater of Operations. They performed the interrogation. They were intercepting radio messages. They went into the caves of Saipan and talked the Japanese soldiers into surrendering. General Willoughby, who was the aide-de-camp for General MacArthur, said that the Japanese-American soldiers undoubtedly shortened the war by at least 2 years and unquestionably saved at least 1 million American soldier lives.
The work of the Military Intelligence Service was classified. There was no publicity about the Nisei soldiers in the Pacific. However, the extraordinary deeds of valor of the 442nd in Europe were publicly recognized by the Army.
They fought in Europe, of course, and they covered themselves with glory. They have the most outstanding record of any military unit in the United States Armed Forces.
They brought home over 20,000 decorations for valor. They brought home 9,468 Purple Hearts. The battalion strength is 3,000. Their casualty rate was 300%.
In 1944, the U.S. government reinstated the draft, mandatory military service for Nisei incarcerated in the camps. In 8 of the camps, there were young men who refused to register for the draft as a protest against the government unjustly incarcerating them and their families. They were arrested on federal charges of draft evasion. Min was granted temporary leave from Minidoka to visit some of the camps in order to recruit for the 442nd and to dissuade the draft resistors.
We felt that it was important to make the rounds of the camp to insist that it put the protesters in a far better position to say we have fulfilled our obligations and therefore our rights are due to us.
The strongest draft resistance movement was at the Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming. A group called the Fair Play Committee was formed by over 80 men who declared that they were willing to fight for their country, but not until their civil rights were restored.
I can still remember at the Federal Correctional Institute, an 18-year-old kid. This kid would grip the bars and tears would be coming down his eyes, and he says, "Look, my father's in a camp someplace in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My mother's alone at Grenada. We have a 14-year-old sister. Who's going to take care of them if I go off to war?"
The draft resistors had a strong moral argument, but as an attorney, Min felt that they could not win their case since the draft was constitutional. It applied equally to all male citizens, regardless of race. He counseled the resistors.
Don't violate the conscription requirements because you're going to put a criminal record on your life, and certainly it's not going to help your mother and sister.
Min and the JACL met with the prosecuting attorneys and wrote to the FBI asking for leniency for the draft resistors, given the circumstances in which they and their families were living. But to no avail. The draft resistors were convicted and sentenced to 2 to 5 years in federal penitentiaries. After Min's unsuccessful attempt to counsel the draft resistors, he returned again to Minidoka, where a number of families were still imprisoned. He applied for permanent leave while continuing to provide free legal services for those who remained in camp. In June of 1944, his application was approved.
Gave me a one-way ticket to Chicago, Illinois, and a check for $25 for clothes on my back.
After a brief stint in Chicago, Min joined his family in Denver, where he enrolled in a course on Colorado law.
I took the bar examination in 1945 in June, and the secretary for the Colorado Supreme Court says I was number 1 on the list, but they wouldn't admit me because I had been convicted of a crime, and they said I'm a person of bad moral character.
He appealed this decision with the help of the ACLU and was licensed to practice law in Colorado in 1946.
And it was only after I passed the bar I decided, well, I'll ask your mother to marry me because...
Then you at least know.
Yeah, I have something to do with it. Before that time, I was just a bum. I was just an ex-convict.
Min married True Shibata, who helped him set up his one-man law firm. He hired Jun Aochi, fresh out of high school, as his secretary.
Min, he would work in the back room and I would be in the front room. And I would see the people coming in and out to see him for legal advice. And he was also, at that time, the president of the Mountain Plains JCL. He was in his office working night and day, not charging anybody. His generosity really impressed me because he was doing everything pro bono, not only for the Japanese Americans, but also for Latinos, the youth, the seniors. We always talked about trying to get citizenship for our parents.
Masuo Yasui, who was released from the Santa Fe camp in 1946, never returned to Hood River. He and Shizuyo moved to Portland, Oregon. For the JACL, naturalization rights for the Issei became a top priority at their first post-war national convention, which Min helped to organize in Denver.
He traveled to Wyoming, to Texas, he traveled to New Mexico. Wherever there was any Japanese people in a community, he would go there and talk to them about supporting the Naturalization Act.
In 1952, Congress passed legislation enabling Asian immigrants to become U.S. citizens. Since Masuo was well-read in the U.S. system of government and history, he initiated and taught Americanization classes to help other Issei pass the citizenship exam. He and Shizuyo were among the first Issei to become naturalized U.S. citizens. In Denver, men continued to speak out. And with other activists of all races and creeds, he helped to found and develop numerous community organizations dedicated to social justice.
In 1951, the City Council did enact an ordinance creating a Commission on Human Relations. It's a beautiful ordinance. It says, go forth and do good. Well, I joined the commission as a member. Thereafter was elected chair, and in 1967 was appointed the executive director.
The name of the commission was changed to Community Relations. Men recruited and developed a diverse staff.
The one thing I loved about him is that Mr. Yasui was very committed to equality for all people, not just for Japanese people, but for Black people and Hispanic people. He was always encouraging all of us to reach for the top.
My grandmother was Betty Salazar, and when I first asked her how she got involved in civil rights advocacy, she told me I started at the Human Rights Commission, and Minoru Yasui was the one who gave me a chance to get involved.
She was hired as a secretary, but men noticed her commitment to the commission's goals and to her community.
He said, Betty, I think you've shown that you could work in a professional level.
She was a young Latina. She didn't have a college degree. There weren't a lot of people hiring somebody like her for a high-profile position where she'd be able to advocate on behalf of her community.
I've known Mr. Yasui since I was 5 because my mom worked for him. And sometimes that would require my mom to go back to the office to get materials on evenings and Saturdays, and Mr. Yasui was always in the office. At times I thought he lived there. He's always working, always working.
In 1977, the City Council created the Minoru Yasui Community Volunteer Award. Whereas Mr. Yasui has served the community with honor, dignity, and dedication for over 30 years as an outstanding leader in youth, civic, educational, and service organizations, and whereas he has worked unceasingly and in countless ways for the betterment of the community, be it resolved that the Mayor and City Council of Denver hereby record their admiration and affection for Minoru Yasui by officially naming the Minoru Yasui Community Volunteer Award.
He really modeled everything that the Minoru Yasui Community Volunteer Awards stand for.
I'm grateful that my children and my grandchildren are part of the continuing the struggle.
He demonstrated that this is a lengthy process. It's not for the faint of heart. You definitely have to be able to persevere.
He really had the courage to persevere and stay the course. He took his activism from the courtroom to the boardroom, to the city council, to the community of Denver.
In the 1970s, JACL began to discuss strategies for a redress campaign, seeking an official apology and reparations from the U.S. government for the injustices suffered by Japanese Americans during World War II.
Not because it affected 120,000 Japanese Americans, but it affects all Americans.
Min is probably recognized best for his tremendous redress efforts, traveling around the country, giving speeches.
We are concerned with the very fundamental constitutional issue of whether or not the government of the United States can indeed make distinction between citizens on the basis of ancestry or national origin.
Min was chair of the National JACL Redress Committee, and in 1981, he testified in Washington, D.C. before the Federal Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians.
I can remember 37 years ago, 29 days, I came out of the county jail in Portland, Oregon with handcuffs on my wrists, with leg shackles on my ankles. There is no amount of money that can ever repay us for the kinds of things that we underwent. Who is going to give me back 9 months of solitary confinement? Who can put a price tag upon that kind of confinement?
Min was a man on a mission. He wrote thousands of letters and reports, attended thousands of meetings, gave hundreds of interviews and speeches throughout the country. He knew time was running out for the Issei, and his own health was failing. But he wouldn't let up. In 1983, Min and his attorney, Peggy Nagae, reopened his legal case based on evidence that had been suppressed and altered by the government during the war.
This was not only a legal case, it was an educational case, because in times of war, people need to be even more vigilant about their rights, about protection, and not give sway to the fear or to the government saying it's military necessity or it's national security.
Min's case was heard before the district court. His wartime conviction was dismissed, but the judge denied a hearing on government documents that proved that General DeWitt's policies were based not on military necessity, but on racial bias. Because of the ties of race, it was impossible to establish the identity of the loyal and the disloyal. An exact separation of sheep from the goats was unfeasible. Peggy and Min appealed to the circuit court for a hearing to establish a legal precedent against racial discrimination by the government under the guise of national security.
I shall always remember, he said to me, I don't know if we're going to win, but we're going to give him hell. And that to me is his legacy. The quality of our struggle makes us humane and brings out the best in people and says we shall not let this wrong happen again. He stood for that. He continues to stand for that.
In the midst of his work on redress, and while his legal case was on appeal, Min Yasui died in Denver on November 12, 1986. He was buried in his beloved hometown of Hood River, Oregon. 2 years later, Congress passed and President Ronald Reagan signed the Redress Bill.
We saw the president signing that bill, and my greatest regret is, this shouldn't be me. It should be Min. That was very poignant. That was very sad.
He had fought all his life for civil rights, for due process, for redress. He never gave up.
29 years after his death, Peggy Nagae spearheaded the effort to win a Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the nation for Min Yasui. In 2015, President Barack Obama did award a posthumous Medal of Freedom to Minoru Yasui.
Min never stopped fighting for equality and justice for all. Today, Min's legacy has never been more important. It is a call to our national conscience, a reminder of our enduring obligation to be the land of the free and the home of the brave.
From the standpoint of history, I think I'd like to have the American people realize that when you subjugate, when you suppress or oppress any group of people, you are really derogating the rights of all people. Because if you can do it to the least of us,
then you can indeed do it to all of us. I should be just as eager to defend your rights as I am my own, because your rights impinges upon mine. If they take away your rights, they can take away mine. So I will fight to preserve yours. If there is suffering or pain that is unfairly imposed upon anyone, it's my duty, it's your duty to try to alleviate it, because that's the way in which we gain a better life for all of us.